So it's already been almost 2 years since I last made the video the most forgotten vehicles in War Tycoon. This video was actually made in 2024 and so many things have actually changed since then, so I thought why not make another video the most forgotten vehicles in the game as of this current moment. So the first vehicle is going to be the Katyusha. I have not seen this thing used in such a long time, and it's honestly really sad since this is a very cool vehicle in real life. However, in the game it's just not very good, so I do understand why it wouldn't be used. So what the Katyusha is essentially supposed to be in this game is kind of like an upgrade to the HIMARS, since the HIMARS only has 6 rockets and this thing has 16, and the way in which this vehicle is supposed to work is it's kind of supposed to overwhelm the enemies with the rockets because you got so many of them, except it's not very good at doing that because the recoil and the damage per hit is just terrible. And what's interesting is that this thing isn't very precise, and that's a good thing because it's kind of similar to how it is in real life. However, the difference is that the real life Katyusha and its rockets actually have really high area of effect, where in the game unfortunately that is not the case, which is what makes the Katyusha so much worse. But anyway, jumping into another vehicle which I haven't seen in such a long time, that unfortunately has to be the HIMARS. And this thing is actually pretty good as of this current moment. It has its 6 indirect rockets, which over 5 of them is more than enough to actually kill any tank or any ground vehicle in the game. And I'm honestly so shocked I was able to actually beat a BMPT Terminator with this in a 1v1. I would feel embarrassed if I was that Terminator because that is not the best match for me, and I was able to surprisingly win it even in close range. But yeah guys, do let me know in the comment section down below, do you even use the HIMARS? But I personally haven't seen this thing in a few years now. Now moving into the next vehicle, I'm gonna be picking this Z10, and this is really sad to say since the Z10 is a newly added vehicle. It's only came to the game I believe 3 months ago or somewhere like that, so reasonably it should still be used quite a lot. However, the reason why people do not use it very much is because it has 2 major flaws which everybody hates. For one, this is the only heli in the game which cannot aim its cannon very high, which is really annoying since if planes are trying to go from above or even trying to be on the same level as you in terms of height, you'll simply not be able to even hit them a lot of the time, which is what really sucks. Now the next thing which really sucks about the Z10 is that the torpedoes unfortunately don't even work. You kind of just fire them at tanks and ground vehicles, but in reality they don't track, they don't go after ships, so they're basically like bombs in a sense. I really suggest you guys to be using them like bombs. However, the Z10 does have one very underrated feature, and that's going to be its missiles, because funny enough, its missiles do longbow level damage, and they're also extremely efficient against ground vehicles. So in reality, if you manage to play your cards right with this thing, you'd be able to actually do really well, since the missiles on their own will be able to carry you. But since there's only 4 of them, the reload speed of them is also pretty fast, so you'll be able to kind of get back into combat after a certain fight extremely quickly. So I do think this thing is actually kind of underrated, but I do understand why it's very forgotten, since it does have some major flaws. Also, let me just pause for a minute and ask you guys a question. What in the world are these textures? Did they make an update to the map, or are my textures just not loading in properly? Do let me know in the comment section if the same thing happened to you over here. Now, moving into the next vehicle, that unfortunately has to be the Su-25 Frogfoot. Once again, I have not seen this thing in years since its release. I believe on release this thing was actually pretty good, since the meta was much different back then, where the skill was much more required to actually be able to kill people on the ground. However, now weaponry like rockets and bombs just simply doesn't work. The bombs are too slow for the meta, and the rockets are just way too hard to hit against many enemies. So in reality, all this plane is left with is a mid-turning speed and 2 air-to-air missiles. I do actually have to say, if you do know what you're doing, then you can make this thing work pretty well when it comes to air combat. However, when it comes to ground combat, you really need guided bombs and anti-tank missiles these days if you want to actually put a dent in the enemy, unless you're going to be playing it perfectly with the cannon, because the rockets and the bombs are kind of useless now, unfortunately. Now moving into the next one, and this is not really a surprise to anybody, the Thermo is by far the most forgotten ship in the game. I don't think I've seen this thing in years either, even after they buffed this thing multiple times. It is just simply not that good. However, if you do manage to actually play this thing pretty well, then you can actually do really well with it. The DPS of this boat is still extremely good. However, what it really lacks is the ability to kill ground vehicles. If you're not tall enough, then you're not going to be able to really hit anything on the ground, unfortunately. That's just how the boat's this work. Now moving into the next vehicle, which is actually going to be a submarine, which might come off as a surprise to all of you, but it's going to be the Los Angeles class, which is actually newly added. However, the reason why I see a lot of people not actually using this is because they added the Bore class and the Typhoon class, which leads a lot of people to just think that these two are gonna be much better than the Los Angeles class. However, that is just totally not true, and I'm gonna be explaining to you guys why that's the case. I feel like this vehicle is extremely slept on, and the reason for that is because people just naturally assume that the Typhoon and the Bore class are naturally gonna be better. However, that is just not true, because what they unfortunately have is their TV guided missiles are not gonna be able to one-tap enemies. I'm talking about the base TV guideds, which you can fire underwater. However, they will not be able to one-tap for those vehicles. However, if you want to use the nuke missiles, which are the suborbitals, you unfortunately have to actually stay above water and not underwater, which really leads you to just get killed. However, what the Los Angeles class has standing for it is the ability to maintain complete stealth while still being able to one-shot air vehicles, which, as you guys can see right now on the screen, you're able to fire these missiles from underwater, and you're also able to one-shot enemies. It is the only submarine in the game which is able to one-shot air vehicles with its TV-guided missiles, which is what makes this thing quite strong. But with this, its health is also pretty close to the Bore class, so I really don't understand why people are not using this thing. But anyway, now moving into a tank, and this one is pretty obvious for everyone, the Bradley linebacker. The reason why people do not use this is pretty simple. It is just a worse version of the normal Bradley, because the normal Bradley provides you with 2 guided missiles, or the M2A2 Bradley provides you with just the Stinger missiles. And you guys already know from experience the guided missiles are always going to be superior in this meta, since they just have a higher level of versatility and just an overall better damage output. However, it doesn't mean that the Bradley linebacker is any worse than the normal Bradley. It's in fact still pretty good, and this thing can work like a brawler, except its Stinger missiles are not as good in the modern meta anymore, because most planes and helicopters have more flare counts now, meaning that every shot basically has to count for this thing, and it just simply doesn't have enough missiles to be able to bait out flares effectively and still be able to kill the enemies. Now with this, we also have the ADATs, which is extremely forgotten, once again for a very good reason, to be totally honest with you guys. This thing is just simply a worse Bradley and a worse linebacker too. And what's interesting about this thing is that it literally uses the chassis of the Bradley, however it still has a way lower health. I don't understand how that makes sense. It does also have a lower speed than the Bradley, and what I believe they should definitely do with this thing is just give it the same stats as the normal Bradley, and perhaps even buff its anti-air missiles, because these missiles have not been buffed in years and they just simply kind of suck against air vehicles. Funny enough, an anti-air vehicle that the ADATS is actually better at killing ground vehicles than air vehicles. Make it make sense, War Tycoon. But anyway, for the time being, that's basically all I have for you guys in today's video. Do let me know in the comment section down below whatever ranking video like this I should do next. These are really fun to do,